I walked out of the reception hall without saying a word, crossed the parking lot in my good shoes, and handed the envelope to the man sitting on the curb by the entrance gate. He looked up at me, confused. I told him it was his. Then I went back inside and sat down. That was the moment everything changed, though nobody in that room knew it yet. My daughter got married on a Saturday in October, up near Bury, at one of those vineyard venues that charges you $4,000 just to use the property. My wife, her mother, had been planning the wedding for 2 years. Every detail was hers. The flowers, the seating chart, the menu, the playlist. I was there to sign the checks. That's mostly what I'd been for the last 11 years. I should explain how we got here, because none of this makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning, for me, starts with a Tuesday afternoon in March, roughly 12 years ago, when my wife walked into the kitchen of our house in Newmarket and told me her daughter was coming to live with us. Her daughter, not ours. My wife had been married before. Briefly, she said, a mistake she'd rather not talk about. Her daughter, she was 9 at the time, had been living with the girl's father and his mother out in Sudbury. Something had changed with that arrangement. My wife didn't go into detail. She never went into detail about anything that made her look complicated. The girl's name was Cassidy. I wanted to be careful about how I describe Cassidy, because the story is not about her being a bad person. She wasn't. She was a child when she arrived, small for her age, quiet in the way that kids are quiet when they've been moved around too many times and have learned that making noise draws the wrong kind of attention. She had her mother's dark eyes and a habit of reading at the kitchen table while everyone else watched television. I liked her immediately. What I didn't like, and didn't say out loud for almost a decade, was the way my wife used Cassidy as a reason to keep me at arm's length from everything. I wasn't allowed to help with her school registration because my wife wanted to handle it herself. I wasn't included in the parent-teacher meetings because my wife said the teachers would find it confusing. When Cassidy had a rough patch in grade 7 and her teachers suggested family counselling, my wife went alone and came home and told me everything was fine. I paid for everything. I drove Cassidy to swim practice on Tuesday mornings before school. I waited in the parking lot reading the paper. When she needed braces, I found the orthodontist and made the appointments and drove her there and sat in the waiting room while she cried a little the first time because it hurt. My wife was at a work thing. My wife was often at a work thing. By the time Cassidy was in high school, she called me by my name, which was Walter. No, I'm not going to let that stand. My name is Edmund. She called me Edmund, not Dad, and not anything warmer than that. My wife had set that up early and I'd gone along with it because I was trying not to overstep. That's what I told myself. I didn't want to overstep. I understand now that I was just afraid of my wife's reaction if I pushed for more. That's a hard thing to admit at 63 years old, that for most of your marriage, you were afraid of your wife's reaction, not physically afraid. She never raised a hand. But there's another kind of fear that lives in the stomach, the kind that comes from knowing that if you say the wrong thing, the temperature in the house will drop 20 degrees and stay there for 2 weeks. And every conversation will be a recitation of your failures until you apologize for something you didn't do wrong. That kind of fear is quiet and patient, and it wears you down in ways you don't notice until one day you realize you haven't expressed an opinion about anything in years. Cassidy left for university in Guelph when she was 18. I helped move her in. We drove down with her things packed into my truck, and she sat in the passenger seat, and we talked the whole way, really talked, about her plans and her worries, and the fact that she was nervous about the roommate situation. And it was one of the better days I can remember from that period. My wife had a scheduling conflict and met us there later, after we'd already set up the room, and she walked in and took over, and the easy thing that had been happening between Cassidy and me in the car quietly closed back up like a book. Over the next 4 years, Cassidy called the house maybe every 2 weeks. She always asked for her mother. That was fine. That was her mother. I was the man who'd been in the house. She graduated with a degree in environmental science and got a job with a consulting firm in Toronto. And 2 years after that she brought home a young man named Theo. He was from Mississauga, quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from being thoughtful rather than shut down, and he worked in urban planning and seemed genuinely in love with her. I liked him. We talked about hockey the first night he came for dinner, and he had actual opinions, not just polite ones. My wife spent the entire dinner talking to Cassidy and barely included either of us. They got engaged the following spring. Cassidy called to tell us, and my wife screamed into the phone with joy and then held the phone out to me so I could say something too. I said congratulations and that Theo seemed like a wonderful person and that I was happy for her. Cassidy said thank you, Edmund. Then they went back to talking about venues. The wedding planning was entirely between them. I received occasional updates from my wife at dinner, the way you receive weather reports, informational, not conversational. The venue was booked. The caterer was confirmed. The dress had been chosen and I was not to ask about it because that was bad luck. The table arrangements were being finalized and I would be seated with my wife's cousin Barb and her husband and two of the other older guests. My wife and Cassidy would be at the head table. I had asked, once early in the planning, whether I would be walking Cassidy down the aisle with my wife. She looked at me the way she sometimes looked at me when she thought I'd said something foolish. She explained that Cassidy's biological father was going to be there and that it would be confusing, and she didn't want the day to be about anyone's feelings. I nodded. I said that made sense. I went back to reading my book. That night I sat in the garage for a long time in the dark with the radio on low. I had given 11 years. I had paid for the braces and the university visits, and the car insurance on the used Civic we'd helped Cassidy buy in her second year. I had shoveled the driveway and fixed the leaking tap in the bathroom, and sat up late on Tuesday nights helping Cassidy with the calculus she was struggling with in grade 11, doing problems side by side at the kitchen table until she got it. Until she actually got it and wrote down the answer herself and looked surprised and pleased. I had done all of that from the outside. The week before the wedding, I went to my bank branch on Davis Drive and took out a certified check. Not a small one. I want to be clear that the amount mattered, not because money is what feelings are worth, but because I had spent a long time calculating what I wanted to do, and this was the thing I decided on. The check was for $60,000. It represented money I'd saved quietly, separately, in an account my wife didn't know about, not because I was hiding it with bad intent, but because I'd learned over the years that having something that was only mine was the only thing that kept me sane. I wrote a letter to go with it. The letter took me 3 evenings to get right. I'm not a writer. I'm a retired project manager who spent 30 years coordinating construction timelines in the GTA, and I express myself more clearly with spreadsheets than with sentences, but I wrote the letter. I said things in it I had never said out loud. I put the check and the letter into an envelope and I brought it to the wedding. I want to tell you about the man by the gate. His name, I later found out, was Malcolm. He was sitting on the curb near the entrance to the vineyard property, not on the actual road, just in that gravel strip between the gate and the parking area. He had a canvas bag and a paper cup of coffee from Tim Hortons that someone had apparently given him earlier in the day. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't asking for anything. He was just there. When I arrived and got out of my car, I walked over and introduced myself. He looked wary, the way people look when they're not sure if they're about to be told to move along. I told him he wasn't in trouble and asked if he'd eaten today. He said not much. I went back to my car and found the granola bars I keep in the console for long drives and brought them back, and we talked for a few minutes. He was from Windsor originally. He'd been working in construction in the city, insulation work, and had been injured on a job site 2 years back, shoulder, then complications, then time off, then no job to go back to. He was trying to get back to Windsor, but it wasn't going as quickly as he'd hoped. He was matter-of-fact about it. He didn't seem to want pity, and I wasn't offering any. I went inside. I sat at my table with Barb and her husband, who were pleasant enough, and I watched Cassidy walk down the aisle on the arm of a man I'd never met, a biological father, who had flown in from somewhere out west and stood up there in a suit that didn't quite fit and looked like he was doing his best. Cassidy was beautiful. I want to say that plainly. She was 26 years old, and she was wearing her mother's determination in her eyes, and she had Theo's hand, and she was smiling the real smile, the one that goes all the way up. I had not been part of making that day happen in any meaningful way, but I felt something watching it. Something complicated that I won't try to reduce to a single word. The reception moved from the ceremony space to the barn venue, and dinner was served, and the speeches went around the table. My wife gave a long speech about Cassidy that included many memories I hadn't been part of, and a few that I had, though she didn't mention me in any of them. Cassidy's biological father gave a short speech that was clearly rehearsed and a little stiff but sincere. Theo's best man gave the funny one that the room needed. At some point during the evening there was a moment where gifts were acknowledged, and I brought the envelope to the gift table. My wife was standing nearby, and she saw me set it down and came over and asked what was in it. I said it was a card. She said, "Let me see it." I said it was a card. She said, "Let me see it." I said it was for Cassidy. She said she was Cassidy's mother, and she'd like to know what was in it. I opened it enough for her to see the check. She looked at it for a moment. Then she took the envelope out of my hand, in a single motion, smooth and practiced, the way you take something from a child who has something they shouldn't. And she held it up and said, loudly enough that the three people nearest to us could hear, that this was the most embarrassing thing I could have done, that showing up to a wedding with a personal check from a separate account was tacky and inappropriate and made us look like we weren't presenting a unified family gift. She called it, specifically, a tacky gesture from a man who still doesn't understand how families work. Tacky. That was the word she used. She put the envelope in her own purse. I stood there for a moment. The three people near us had gone very quiet and very busy looking at other things. My wife turned and walked toward the bar. I went outside. Malcolm was still by the gate. The granola bars were gone. I sat down on the curb next to him, and we didn't say anything for a little while, and then I told him briefly what had just happened, not the long version, just the shape of it. He listened. He didn't offer advice. He said, "That's a long time to carry that." I said, "Yes, it was." I reached into my jacket and took out the original envelope, not the one my wife had put in her purse, which was a copy. I had made 2 copies of everything before the wedding. The one in my wife's purse had a check drawn on the joint account we'd had for years. The one I was holding had the certified check from my private account, along with the real letter. I gave it to Malcolm and asked if he would be willing to do something for me. He was. It cost me nothing to ask, and it turns out it cost him something he didn't have to give, which is why I'm glad he gave it anyway. About 30 minutes later, he came into the reception hall. He'd tidied himself up as best he could, tucked in his shirt, smoothed his hair. One of the servers tried to intercept him at the door, and he politely said he had something to deliver to the bride, and something in his manner, the directness of it, the calmness, got him through. Cassidy was at the head table when Malcolm walked up. Theo was beside her. Malcolm put the envelope down in front of her and said, "Someone asked me to make sure you got this," and then he left. I watched from across the room. I was seated again at my table, drinking water, watching. Cassidy opened the envelope. She read the letter first, and I watched her face move through several things. Confusion, then something that looked like recognition, then something that looked like pain. She put the letter down and looked at the check. She looked around the room. Her eyes found me. I looked back at her. Then her eyes went to her mother, who was at the far end of the bar, laughing at something with one of her cousins, and Cassidy's expression changed again. She got up from the table and crossed the room to where I was sitting. She sat down in the empty chair next to me that Barb had vacated to get dessert. She put the letter on the table between us. She said, "Edmund, I didn't know about the separate table seating. I asked Mom and she said you preferred to sit with her family. I want you to know I would have wanted you up there." I said, "I know." She said, "What does this mean?" She was pointing to a section of the letter. In the letter, I had told her what I had never said out loud, that when we drove to Guelph for move-in day and she talked to me the whole way without stopping about her fears and her plans, that had been one of the best days of my life, that I had been there for 11 years, trying to be useful without overstepping, and I wasn't sure I'd always gotten the balance right, but I'd never stopped caring about what happened to her. That the money was hers, not her mother's, not a joint gesture. That there was also a safety deposit box at my branch on Davis Drive, and I'd named her as the sole access holder on a secondary box, and the key was taped to the back of the letter. She looked at the back of the letter. The key was there. She said, "What's in it?" I said, "Some things you might want to have. Some things about your history that I think you deserve to know." Her expression went very still. "I'm not going to tell you everything that was in that box, because some of it is hers and not mine to share. But I can tell you that it included documentation I had obtained over the years through my own quiet effort, records that answered questions Cassidy had asked when she was 14, and then again when she was 19, and both times been told by her mother that there was nothing to know. There was quite a lot to know. Cassidy sat next to me for almost 20 minutes. We didn't talk the whole time. At some point her new husband came over and she showed him the letter, and he read it and looked at me and said quietly, "Thank you." That was all he said, but it was the right thing. When my wife finally noticed that Cassidy wasn't at the head table and came to find her, she saw the letter, she saw the envelope, she saw the key, and she knew immediately what had happened, because she had known for 11 years that this key existed and had spent 11 years hoping I would never use it. She looked at me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I said, "I think the three of you have some things to talk about. I'm going to go find Malcolm and make sure he got home safely." I found Malcolm outside. He had started walking toward the main road, that easy, unhurried walk of someone who's learned to take things at whatever pace they come. I drove him to the bus station in Barrie myself, and we stopped at a diner on the way and had coffee and eggs, and he told me about Windsor, and I told him about the years I'd spent in project management, and we talked the way two people talk when they have nothing to prove to each other. Before he got on the bus, I gave him a card with my contact information and told him that if he needed a reference for work, construction, project coordination, anything in the trades or adjacent to them, to call me. I had spent 30 years knowing people in those industries. I said I would make calls. I meant it. He said he'd think about it. He took the card. That was 4 months ago. He did call. 3 weeks after the wedding, he called. I made 4 phone calls over 2 days, and a former colleague of mine who runs a mid-sized general contracting firm in Windsor hired him for a trial period. As of last month, the trial period is over and the position is permanent. He called to tell me, and I was standing in my kitchen in Newmarket making coffee, and I had to put the phone down on the counter for a moment because I didn't want my voice to do something embarrassing. Cassidy and I have talked 3 times since the wedding. Real conversations, not weather reports. She came to the safety deposit box with Theo the week after and spent a long time inside. She didn't tell me everything she found, and I didn't ask, but she called me that evening and talked for almost an hour, and at the end she said, "I wish you'd been at the head table." I said, "Me too." She said she was going to make sure that didn't happen again. I don't know what that means exactly. I'm not in the habit of planning too far ahead anymore, but it means something, and for now, something is enough. My wife and I are separated. I moved out in November and found a rental unit in a building near the hospital, which is close enough to most things that I don't need to drive in the winter, which I've never liked. The unit has large windows and a second bedroom I've turned into a study. I have my books and my coffee and my Tuesday morning routine and a quiet that is entirely my own and does not feel like the cold quiet I spent 11 years in. It feels like room. I'm 63 years old and I am learning what it feels like to have room. Cassidy sent me a picture last week. She and Theo standing in front of a piece of property they're looking at in Hamilton, one of those older brick houses that needs work. She texted, "We're thinking of putting in an offer." Theo says we'll need advice on the renovation planning. Know anyone? I wrote back that I might know 1 or 2 people. She sent a laughing emoji and then, a minute later, just, "Thank you, Edmund." I sat with that for a while, then I put my phone in my pocket and went to make dinner. Some things don't need an answer, they just need to be received. I've been sitting with this for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually taught me. Not the tidy version you'd put on a card. The real one. What I keep coming back to is Malcolm. Not because his story is more dramatic than mine, it isn't, but because of what he did with almost nothing. He had a canvas bag and a paper cup of coffee and a shoulder that hadn't healed right, and when I asked him to walk into a wedding reception full of strangers and deliver an envelope to the bride, he tucked in his shirt and did it with more dignity than most people I've known who had every advantage. That's not luck, that's character. The kind that doesn't come from circumstance. It comes from what you decide to do with yourself when circumstance hasn't been kind. I think about the 11 years I spent being careful not to overstep, careful not to say the wrong thing, careful not to make the temperature drop. And I understand why I did it. There's a kind of slow reasoning that happens in a difficult marriage where you convince yourself that keeping the peace is the same as doing the right thing. It isn't. Doing the right thing sometimes costs something. Keeping the peace sometimes costs everything else. What I didn't do for too long was think clearly about what I actually knew. I had information. I had documentation I'd quietly gathered over the years. I had a separate account, a key, a letter I kept revising and never sending. None of that required luck. It required paying attention and being honest with myself about what I was seeing, even when I didn't want to see it. That kind of clear-eyed thinking, sitting with uncomfortable facts instead of explaining them away, that's what eventually made it possible to do something useful instead of just something reactive. Ann Cassidy. She sat down next to me at that table, and the first thing she said wasn't about the money or the box or the letter. She said she hadn't known about the separate seating. She said she would have wanted me up there. 11 years of standing at the edge of things, and she noticed. She'd been noticing for a while. She just hadn't had the information to act on it, and neither had I, really, until we did. That's the thing nobody tells you about getting older. You think patience is just waiting. It isn't. Real patience is continuing to show up, continuing to pay attention, continuing to do the quiet work of being decent even when nobody's acknowledging it. Not because you expect a reward, but because it's what you decided you were going to be. The reward, if it comes, is almost beside the point. What matters is that you didn't let bitterness make the decisions for you. I moved into my rental unit in November, and the first night I sat in the study with the window open and listened to the street, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not happy exactly. Settled, like I was finally in the right room. Malcolm called 3 weeks after the wedding. Cassidy texted a picture of a brick house in Hamilton. 2 people, each of them carrying something hard, each of them still standing. That's enough. That has always been enough.